Greetings. Welcome to another episode of Powered by Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Gunadu. On this episode, our focus will be anger. Now, anger, I want to make it clear here, is defined as a spirit. Yes, I said it, a spirit. And I'll explain why I say anger is a spirit as the best way to not only understand anger, how it affects us, and what to do about it. So, anger is a spirit. What do I mean by that? I mean this. Have you or know someone that has been angry, and I mean very angry, and as soon as they sort of snap out of it, they will say, I can't believe I did that. Let me take you back to a few scenarios that you're familiar with. Let's take the movies, for example. In the movies, often the killer or the murderer, the person takes on the person's life or lives, will have a moment where they snap. And in that snapping, they will almost come to or come back to their normal senses and say, I can't believe I did this. Let's pause there and break down what just happened in that fictitious but more likely real scenario. In that scenario, the spirit that is anger, it feeds on our vulnerability, our disruption. That is, when we lose our balance, essentially lose our better judgment, better senses, and control over the various kinds of passions and emotions that reside within the human being. That spirit, called anger, then preys on those vulnerabilities. Much like a computer virus preys on vulnerabilities within your computer system, likewise, anger as a spirit or is a spirit preys on vulnerabilities, imbalances, whatever you want to call it, within your human being system. And when it preys on it, it is like any other spirit that takes a hold of our bodies for the moment in which the anger, in this case, transpires. And so as soon as the anger leaves, that is, the spirit leaves, the person will almost come to and essentially begin to what? Reflect on what happened or what happened within, that short or long period of time in which they were under the spell of the spirit of anger. And when they come to, they almost have this sort of epiphany where it is, I can't believe it. Imagine this. To kill someone or to harm someone or including yourself takes a split second. And in those moments is where the spirit of anger takes control. Now, the spirit of anger can only take control if we are what? Vulnerable. If we are compromised. If our being is out of stasis, out of balance, out of whack, out of order. And the more that we are filled with anxieties, stresses, as well as pressures, both those we place upon ourselves, burdens that are both real and fictitious, that is, things that we imagine in our heads that are not really there, but they become real because they reside within the spirit of the mind, and that spirit, essentially takes a hold of our consciousness and our thought processes. So whatever the particular form and then the content, of the vulnerabilities or imbalances within our beings, that spirit of anger takes a hold. Now, I, like you, have been angry before. In fact, there's no one that's living as a human being on this planet and that has lived that has not been angry. And I mean very angry. So there's no big or small to anger. Anger is anger, right? And often comes down to what we do with that anger. Some of us are able to, this is a strategy, some of us are able to grab a hold of the anger before it gets out of control. That is, before the spirit of anger takes full control over the bodily functions. I mean, the mind as well as the bodily functions. Some of us are able to essentially in mid-flight or in midstream grab a hold of ourselves, right? Before we complete the act. And so there's a number of ways in which we detect and identify the spirit of anger. We may not call it such, but I want to make it very clear that it is such because there's a certain power and force that anger has over us that's almost uncontrollable in many ways. Think about the very notion and practice of road rage. That is, people who are cursing out, who are angry, who even get out of their cars and chase down people sometimes violently with weapons and look to do them harm, right? Road rage is a manifestation or one example of the spirit of anger. Anger also appears itself in our relationships, right? When certain key words or certain kinds of back and forth or arguments spill over into a kind of anger that becomes very violent. And by violent, I don't mean necessarily physical or bodily violence. That's one form of violence, but not the most dangerous form of violence, because there is a spirit of anger that essentially what holds in the tensions and the anger toward that person for which the anger is directed. And oftentimes the anger is directed to people that have nothing to do with the reasons why we're angry in many cases. But suffice to say, that spirit of anger can be what? Held up, bent up, built up. And then, of course, it outpours upon the person who is the target of the anger. And oftentimes it is not the person or the people who are the target of the anger. And so the buildup and the holding in of that spirit of anger will have to spill over, because there's so much that our human beings, our human bodies can hold. There's a limited capacity, for containing that spirit of anger. And so now that we know how to identify the spirit of anger, when it begins to bubble up, when it begins to rear its head, when we begin to not think clearly, when we are unable to be calm, these are all the indications of the spirit of anger is trying to take a hold of our human being. What to do? First and foremost, it is to be calm. Now that's easier said than done, particularly when you're in the heat of the moment, right? The best thing to do is to practice, role play, right? That is, in other words, with yourself or with somebody you trust, with a companion, with a mate, you name it, friends, practice, role play out the spirit of anger, right? So have one of them, for example, pinch you or say some very nasty things to you. And as you begin to boil up, right? Don't look around, look within and count to 3. And in that count to 3, you want to Sort of a cooling down. 3, 2, 1. Why am I angry? Identify the spirit, right? Because the spirit is feeding on something that is within you, that is an imbalance, that is something that's out of order, right? So there's something going on within us, right? Something going on that is allowing for the spirit of anger to feed on that vulnerability. So the key is to cool down, to identify, why am I angry? What's making me angry? Is the angry justified? And if it's justified, do I need to let it out or direct it to the person or persons for whom the anger is caused? In many cases, the anger is really about us. There's something that's with us, that's biting us, eating us, that may have little to do with the person. In other words, a person, no matter how hard they try, cannot make you angry unless you allow yourself to be angry. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean this, and I want you to listen carefully. I mean that no one can make you feel bad or angry or sad unless you allow them to, right? There's something, whether insecurity or an anxiety or our own particular feelings are again, that imbalance within our soul and our spirit, that allows for others to press that proverbial button to generate the anger in this case, that then becomes something else outside of our bodies. And so in most cases, in fact, I would argue in almost all cases, it's something that has to do with us, to do with me, to do with you, not the other person or people. So for example, let's go back to the road rage scenario. In that scenario, yes, the person may cut you off. They may jump in front of you. They didn't signal, or whatever it may be that got you angry. But if you think about it, people on the road, right, drive recklessly. We have to assume that because that's a fact. Not all, but some do. And so you assume that. And so was it the reckless driving that made you angry? Or was it something else before you left the house? Something else on the way to work or to school or wherever you're going in that vehicle? That was pent up, that was held up. And that spirit of anger, feeding on it and say, hey, I'm going to manifest myself in this moment, i.e. road rage for that example. Or at our children, if you have children. There are many times in which the anger is, yes, children can be annoying, things can be a lot of things. But oftentimes the anger is really something with us, right? Lack of patience, inability to recognize that the child just wants your attention, or the child simply wants a hug, or the child misses you but doesn't have the tools yet to communicate that effectively to you. In other words, to communicate their emotions, right? Children can communicate a lot of things, and even the most precocious ones. But one thing they can't communicate very well, is very awkward, is their feelings, right? And so they may not be able to communicate that clearly or effectively enough for you as the adult to recognize and to see. And so oftentimes the anger is not with the child, no matter how much they rise your temperature. The anger is usually something with us, right? In other words, our response to the thing that we think is annoying, that is what creates the anger, generates the anger. It's something usually with us, right? So as a parent, we have to look at ourselves and say, what is it within me in those moments that essentially triggers or generates the anger towards the child that I claim to love, or the children that I claim to love, right? Because they know we can justify being violent, whether with words or with our hands or other means, to the people that we love, if we say we love them. God doesn't allow for that, right? So then we have to look at ourselves. And finally, before we wrap up this episode on anger, the spirit of anger will not go away. It will not disappear. It is omnipresent, right? And the best way to think about this matter is as a spirit, as I've argued. Because if you think about it as a spirit, then it's something that is really outside of us, but it can enter us. And as it enters us, it feeds on what? Our vulnerabilities, our ability or inability to be in balance and to be in stasis, right? And once it takes a hold of us, we still have a chance to what? Arrest it, right? To grab a hold of it, essentially grab a hold of yourself, right? And you will hear that very often, take a hold of yourself, a little bit of self-control. And the way we get to that is practice. Practice in real life scenarios, with your mate, with your spouse, with your children, with your friends, with your families, but also by yourself, the role play. And once we get that conscious practice into our subconscious, then we begin to better manage our anger, because it won't go away. You can't make anger disappear. You can't make anger vanish, because the spirit of anger is a spirit, which means it's omnipresent, right? It's always going to be there. The job for us is to recognize it, handle it, and be able to move through most of those angering scenarios with a cool head, with a cool mind, and with a cool heart. What you can also do is pour some cold water on the floor as well, right? By your feet. Even pour some on your back and a little bit on your head. Those are other ways to cool down. Or step back, step aside as soon as you see yourself getting angry, right? And then of course check yourself and then approach the situation with more tact and more calmness. But Baba Nyame, I've been your guide and host. Until next time, please drop your comments and questions and experiences down below. Until then, stay well.